Every story about locomotives is really a story about something else. The stories about the fastest locomotives are really stories about national pride and the hunger for records. The stories about the most powerful are really stories about the ambition of engineers and the demands of industry. The stories about the ones that failed are really stories about the gap between what human beings dream and what physics permits. All of these stories matter. All of them deserve to be told. But there is a category of locomotive story that almost never gets told because it doesn't contain any of the elements that make stories easy to tell. No records, no disasters, no breakthrough moments of engineering inspiration. Just a machine doing its job day after day, year after year, in a place too small to attract attention, for people too ordinary to be considered historically significant. These are the locomotives that never appear in books, the ones that no railway photographer made a special journey to capture, the ones that were maintained and operated by men whose names were never recorded anywhere except in the payroll ledgers of companies that were themselves eventually absorbed and dissolved and forgotten. And yet these locomotives, the unrecorded ones, the branch line engines and the industrial shunters and the colliery locomotives that spent their entire working lives within sight of the same hills, were, in their own way, as important as anything that ever set a speed record or hauled a royal train. This is the story of one of those locomotives. Not a famous one, not a technically remarkable one. A locomotive that spent 47 years running an 8-mile branch line in the Welsh valleys, that was operated by a succession of crews who knew it the way you know a neighbor rather than the way you know a celebrity. And that became, over those 47 years, so woven into the fabric of a small community that when it was finally withdrawn from service, the reaction in the valley it had served was not the polite, nostalgic regret that accompanies the retirement of famous locomotives, but something rawer and more personal, something closer to genuine loss. The Rhymney Valley branch line in South Wales was not a glamorous piece of railway. It had been built in the 1870s to serve the collieries that occupied the upper reaches of the valley, carrying coal down to the main line connection at the bottom and bringing supplies and workers back up in the other direction. The passenger service that had developed alongside the coal traffic was a modest affair, a few trains a day connecting the villages strung along the valley with the market town at its foot, used by miners traveling to and from work, by women visiting shops that the villagers couldn't support, by children going to schools that the villages were too small to maintain. It was exactly the kind of local service that was economically marginal from the day it opened, and that continued operating less because it was profitable than because the communities it served had organized their lives around its existence. The locomotive assigned to this service in the spring of 1921 was a small tank engine of a type that the Rhymney Railway the company that operated the valley, used throughout its system for secondary and branch line work. It was numbered 37 inches, the company's fleet, and had been built at the company's own workshops at Caerphilly in 1919. 2 years before it arrived at the Valley Depot, that would be its home for the next 4.5 decades. It had no name. Branch line tank engines rarely did. Names were for the expresses, for the locomotives that hauled trains important enough to deserve them. Number 37 was not that kind of locomotive. It was the kind of locomotive that hauled the 6:15 from the top of the valley every weekday morning, and the 7:45 from the bottom every weekday evening, and the market day service on Thursdays, that was always too full in both directions, and that the crews learned to coax up the gradient with a care that the timetable didn't officially acknowledge. The men who drove and fired number 37 over the decades of its service formed a sequence of working relationships with the machine that each of them would have described differently, but that all shared a common quality. They knew it. Not in the abstract way that a driver knows the general characteristics of a locomotive class, but in the specific and personal way that comes from operating the same machine on the same route through changing seasons and accumulating years. They knew which gradient demanded the regulator opened a fraction earlier than the textbook suggested. They knew the sound the injector made when the water level in the boiler was approaching the point that required attention before the next climb rather than after. They knew the particular behavior of the valve gear in cold weather when the first workings of the morning required a period of gentle operation before the locomotive was ready to be asked for full effort. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It was transmitted in the way that practical knowledge about specific machines has always been transmitted informally and personally from the men who were leaving to the men who were arriving. A retiring driver sitting in the cab with his successor on the first few workings, not formally instructing but simply operating, allowing the new man to observe and feel and begin the process of developing his own relationship with the machine. The knowledge passed this way was imprecise by the standards of the engineering department. It could not be captured in a maintenance manual or a driver's instruction book, but it was real and it was important, and the continuity of service that number 37 provided over 4 decades was partly a product of that informal transmission of accumulated understanding. The community that the locomotive served developed, over the years, a relationship with it that would have seemed disproportionate to anyone unfamiliar with the role that the branch line played in valley life. In communities where the options for movement were limited, where the distance between the village and the town at the valley's foot was short in miles, but significant in practical terms for people without private transport. The railway was not a convenience. It was a lifeline. The timing of the morning working shaped the rhythm of working life in the upper villages. The capacity of the Thursday market service determined how much could be bought and carried home in a single day. The reliability of the evening return shaped what could be planned and what had to remain uncertain. Number 37's mechanical reliability was, given this context, not simply a matter of operational efficiency. It was a matter of genuine social consequence. A locomotive that failed on the morning working meant miners arriving late for their shifts, with consequences that extended from individual wages to the productivity of the collieries that employed much of the valley. A failure on the Thursday service meant women stranded in town with shopping they couldn't carry home, or stranded in the village, unable to reach the town at all. The engine that sat in the small depot at the head of the valley was, in this sense, more deeply connected to the daily welfare of the people it served than any express locomotive on any main line had ever been, because the people who depended on it had nowhere else to go and nothing else to use. The maintenance of number 37 was the responsibility of the Valley Depot's small staff, which at most periods during the locomotive service consisted of a driver, a fireman, a cleaner, and a fitter who visited from the main depot at intervals that were determined by a maintenance schedule rather than by any particular understanding of this specific machine. The fitter's role was to conduct the periodic examinations required by railway regulations and to address any specific defects that the depot crew had identified. The continuous maintenance between those visits was the responsibility of the crew themselves, working within the limits of what the tools and materials available at a small branch depot allowed. This arrangement produced, over the years, a pattern of care and attention that reflected the crew's understanding of what the locomotive meant to the communities they served. Minor defects that a main line depot crew might log for attention at the next scheduled maintenance visit were addressed by the valley crew using initiative and improvisation, because leaving them for the fitter's next visit meant a period of uncertain operation on a service that didn't have a spare locomotive waiting to cover a failure. The culture of the branch depot was one in which the locomotive's continued reliable operation was a personal responsibility that the men who maintained it took seriously in a way that went beyond professional obligation. The records of number 37's maintenance history, fragmentary as they are, tell a story that is consistent with this picture. The periods of unplanned withdrawal from service, the failures that stopped the locomotive running and disrupted the valley service were remarkably infrequent given the age of the machine and the intensity of its use. For a locomotive operating with minimal maintenance resources on a tight schedule through 4 decades, the reliability record was exceptional. Not because the machine was technically exceptional, it was not. It was a standard product of its era, competently designed and adequately built. The reliability came from the attention of the men who kept it running, whose understanding of this particular machine's particular requirements had been built up through years of daily contact, and whose motivation to maintain that reliability was rooted in their own membership of the community the service existed to support. The nationalization of British Railways in 1948 changed the administrative context of Number 37's operation without immediately changing its operational reality. The locomotive continued running, the valley continued being served, and the crews continued their particular relationship with a machine that the new management structures had classified accurately but incompletely as a small tank locomotive of aging design with limited remaining service life. The classification was accurate in the narrow technical sense. In the broader sense, it missed everything that mattered about what the locomotive was and what it did. The conversations about the branch line's future began in the early 1950s and continued with increasing urgency through the decade. The economics were straightforward and unfavorable. The coal traffic that had originally justified the line's existence was declining as the Upper Valley collieries contracted. The passenger traffic covered its direct costs, but contributed nothing to the infrastructure maintenance that a 40-year-old branch line increasingly required. The financial logic pointed toward closure. It pointed toward it clearly enough that by the late 1950s, the question was not whether the branch would close, but when. What delayed the closure longer than the financial logic alone would have justified was a combination of factors, some of them technical and some of them social, that resisted the straightforward arithmetic of the accountants who looked at the branch line's figures. The technical factors related to the specific transportation needs of the valley communities, which lacked the road infrastructure that would have made bus substitution straightforward. The social factors related to the political reality that closing a railway in a Welsh mining valley in the 1950s required navigating a landscape of community organization and local political representation that had strong views about railway services and the ability to express them effectively. Number 37 ran through all of these conversations, indifferent to them in the way that working machines are indifferent to the administrative debates that surround them. It ran the morning workings and the evening workings and the Thursday market service and the occasional extra working that holiday periods or colliery events required. It was maintained by crews who by this point represented the third generation of men to have worked with the machine since its arrival at the Valley Depot. Men who had learned about it partly from older colleagues and partly from their own accumulated experience. The closure came in 1968 in the general contraction of branch line services that followed the Beeching report and its aftermath. The announcement was made with the combination of bureaucratic necessity and bureaucratic insensitivity that characterized many branch line closures of the period. The communities affected were given notice of a fact rather than consultation on a decision. The replacement bus services that were proposed were assessed as adequate by people who had not recently traveled the valley in winter and whose understanding of adequacy did not include the specific needs of shift workers, elderly residents, or mothers with small children and heavy shopping. The final day of service was not a formal occasion. There was no special working, no invited guests, no official ceremony. The valley communities that turned out to watch the last trains run did so not because anyone had organized an event, but because the closure of the service that had been part of their daily lives for decades seemed to require some form of acknowledgement that the administrative process was not providing. Men who had ridden number 37 to their first day of work stood on platforms alongside men who had taken their children to the town on the Thursday service. Women who had used the morning working for shopping trips that no longer existed stood alongside older women who remembered when the service had been more frequent and the valley more populated. Number 37 itself was withdrawn from service in the same year as the branch line closed. The locomotive had been condemned the previous year on the basis of a boiler examination that identified repairs too expensive to justify on a machine of its age. It had continued running under a short extension while arrangements were made, and the coincidence of its withdrawal with the branch line closure gave the two events a symbolic connection that was noticed by the valley communities, even if it had no official significance. The locomotive was not preserved. There was no mechanism available at that moment for preserving a small tank engine from a minor Welsh branch line. Preservation in 1968 was still largely focused on the most famous locomotives, the record breakers, and the Royal Train engines, and the examples of the most celebrated classes. A numbered but unnamed branch line tank engine, however significant to the community it had served, was not the kind of locomotive that preservation organizations were organized to save. It was scrapped. The metal that had constituted number 37 for 47 years was melted down and became something else, as the metal of almost every steam locomotive eventually did. What was not scrapped was the memory of what it had done. The community memory of the Rhymney Valley branch line service, the specific and personal recollection of a locomotive that had been part of daily life for 2 generations, survived in the way that community memories survive. In conversations, in the recollections of older residents interviewed by local historians in subsequent decades, in the fragmentary written records that individuals preserved because they understood instinctively that the records mattered, even if they couldn't have said precisely why. Those records tell a story that the official railway history doesn't tell. Not about technical innovation or record-breaking performance or the ambitions of great engineers. About something quieter and in its own way more fundamental. About a machine that was not exceptional in any measurable technical sense, that was built to a standard design and maintained on a limited budget and operated by men whose names appear in no history of railway engineering, and that, despite all of this, mattered profoundly to the people whose lives it intersected for almost half a century. The locomotives that matter most in history are not always the ones that ran fastest, or hauled most, or broke some barrier that everyone was watching. Sometimes they are the ones that ran reliably, day after day, on routes that nobody was watching, for people who had no alternative and no voice in the decisions that eventually took away what they depended on. Those locomotives left no dynamometer car records, no celebrated photographs, no commemorative publications. They left communities that, decades after the last train ran, still describe their loss with a specificity that reveals how completely those services had been woven into the fabric of daily life. Number 37 was one of those locomotives. There were hundreds of others like it. On branch lines and industrial railways and colliery systems across Britain and across every country where railways carried ordinary people doing ordinary things in places too small to matter to anyone except the people who lived there. History remembers the famous machines, the ones that set records, that made headlines, that became symbols of their era. But the history of what railways actually meant to ordinary people is written in the unrecorded stories of the locomotives that nobody photographed and nobody named, that ran the early working and the market day service and the evening return, and that were, for the communities they served, not symbols of anything at all, just the train there when you needed it